several years ago, in 2016, I went to Minneapolis to climate generation workshop for educators. And I was Jothsna student. And I was so impressed by her teaching style and her interaction with the audience. And I thought, well, it would be so nice to have a similar event at Grand Valley. And climate generation really was that inspiration for our faculty and students to start working with K-12 educators and to start Climate Change Education Solutions Summit. And many of you know that we started in 2018. So I was really grateful to Jothsna and all her colleagues on climate generation. Then in 2019, I went to Minneapolis again. And that time I was there for the climate reality leadership training organized by former Vice President Al Gore. And again, I had an honor to be Jothsna student for the second time. What an amazing coincidence. And she was given a very similar workshop to the one that we are going to experience tonight, except that it was still in person. It was just before the pandemic. And I was hoping to invite Jothsna last year during our conference. And of course, it was impossible because of the pandemic. So I was so grateful that she accepted to join us virtually this year. And I'm so thrilled that she is going to give this presentation and share her really wonderful insights at GVSU. So Jothsna Harris has 7 years of experience building capacity for the climate justice movement. She was most recently, in fact, when we started this conversation, she was still the director of special projects and partnerships at Climate Generation. And she has lots of experience implementing climate change programs. She has done lots of work with the community. She really focuses her work on the personal narrative and value-based ways that resonate with people when she speaks about climate change. She led the creative process for and also co-edited a book, Eyewitness Minnesota Voices on Climate Change. So I hope that we would also have it here at GVSU, and an anthology of community sources, stories and poems and art, and developed a campaign that utilizes the book to build public will and share testimony with legislators to help move climate justice policy. So Jothsna now is an independent consultant for climate storytelling and other climate-related projects, and she currently serves on the Great Northern Board of Directors in Minneapolis. And in her spare time, she's also a small-scale organic farmer. That also brings us together because I am also very much into organic farming. And she's a proud member of the Midwest Farmers of Color Collective. So welcome, Jothsna. We are so thrilled to welcome you to Grand Valley, and looking forward to this workshop.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for having me here and for that beautiful introduction. I feel so humbled by your words, and I'm so happy to be here with you all this evening. It's a privilege for sure. And so, yes, my name is Jothsna Harris, and I'm with Climate Generation, a Will Steger legacy, representing them tonight. And I'm joining you from Minnesota, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of the Dakota, Ho-Chunk, and Anishinaabe people. And I am grateful for technology because it makes us possible to be here. I'm seeing that almost everybody is here from Michigan, and I'm here from Minnesota. So I am thankful that we're able to connect in this way while also being able to reduce greenhouse gases and learn about each other. And so I'm here tonight, and I'm sure that you can resonate with me that working on climate change or even thinking about it is daunting, and it can be downright exhausting. But I'm so inspired to be here with you this evening because I know we are all here because we care about the climate crisis, and we are all committed to doing something about it. So thank you for taking your time to be here tonight. We really need opportunities like this to be able to come together and to get re-energized. And so I ask you to be here in that spirit, to be willing to listen and learn, and to be re-energized in the power of your own story. So during our time together, I will be sharing the power of your story and how it can be an incredible tool for advocating for solutions. And if you are thinking to yourself, I don't have a climate story, or maybe you're saying, I have a climate story, but my story is not important enough to share, I want to assure you that yes, you do have a climate story, and what you have to say is important, and your voice is powerful. So hopefully, as we go through the session this evening, you will walk away with a sense that you absolutely have a story and that you should be sharing it. So I'm going to begin by sharing some slides, and I'll be sharing first some background and context on the power of climate storytelling. And then together, we are going to walk through a guided process where we will individually reflect and get to write our climate stories. So it's going to be sort of a crash course. It will be a speedy process. So don't expect that you will walk away from this session with a fully finished climate story, but hopefully you will have some really good sparks of a climate story that you feel compelled to complete. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I want to begin by sharing a background on the work of climate generation and how climate generation is deeply connected to climate storytelling. So Climate Generation is a nonprofit dedicated to engaging people in solutions to climate change. And at the core of Climate Generation's work is the power of personal narrative. We were founded by Will Steger, who is a polar explorer, an educator, and climate change advocate. And for over 50 years, Will has inspired tens of thousands of people through his chronicles of Arctic adventures and his remarkable accounts of climate change in our polar regions, as a witness to some of the disintegration of some of the world's major ice shelves. And what was remarkable about that was that Will never imagined that would happen during his lifetime, and happen much more quickly than any of the scientific models had projected. And of course, we know that the story of our melting polar ice caps is not a standalone story, but it's an indicator of the rapidly changing climate that is all around us, with ripple effects impacting coastal communities around the world, as well as other repercussions. So Will shared his story as a vehicle, not only to engage people in stories of expedition and Arctic adventures, but also as a way to educate people about climate change, and also to inspire them to take action. So we know that our stories can be a really powerful way to engage people on climate change. But now, with the imprint of climate change all around us, it's not just a few people who are talking about climate change, it's really all of us. And it's become increasingly clear that we are all eyewitnesses to climate change, and we all have powerful stories to share. Often we have been told in our society that the person who is at the front of the room, or the person on speaker view in Zoom, or the person who is behind the podium with the microphone, is the person with the most expertise and credentials to talk about climate change. But we can connect climate change to what we care about, all of us. And we all truly hold expertise in our own experiences. And we should all be part of the climate conversation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of talking about climate change. And we know that research on opinion polling on climate change, according to Yale's climate opinion polling, shows that nearly 70% of Americans understand that climate change is happening and that it will cause harm to future generations. Yet 2/3 of Americans say that they never talk about it. So we know that there's this disconnect, right, between people feeling concerned but lacking confidence. So one of the most important things that we can do to address climate change is to talk about it. It's a tangible action that we can all take to normalize conversations about it, because after all, public opinion drives decision making. So I'm sure that many of you have experienced difficulty in certain spaces talking about climate change. And I think that's a common experience for a lot of people, that it is still not normal in many places to talk about climate change or to bring it up in certain circles. And there's a lot of reasons why it is complicated talking about climate change. So I'm going to list off a few reasons, barriers to talking about climate change. I'm sure that you could help me generate an even longer list, but to start us off, here are a few. The reality of climate change is daunting. Understanding the data, the trends, the impacts, the solutions, it can be overwhelming. And then most of us are not climate scientists, so it can feel difficult to feel like you have all of the facts, the data, and the credentials to make a compelling case. And then to add to this, we are currently in an era of misinformation and disinformation. And unfortunately, the issue and even the science has become politicized. And then, to be honest, many of us have not talked about climate change because there is a real concern or even a fear that we won't be received, we won't be effective, or maybe we might even ruin a relationship. So the combination of these reasons and more make talking about climate change in meaningful ways complicated. So opinions on climate change go far beyond just agreeing on the causes and the consequences, because fundamentally our beliefs and our behaviors stem from our unique identity, worldview, and value systems. So in order to have effective conversations, we actually need to reframe the way that we discuss climate change. We need to have conversations that help us find our shared values and common ground and then build from there. And for a long time, the way that we have talked about climate change in mainstream communications has mostly been from a scientific perspective alone. And while we absolutely need the science is essential, it's actually our stories that place those facts and figures into context. They bring in humanity and they have the potential to make sense for our real lives and how climate change is showing up on the ground. And research tells us that information alone is not enough to move people to change their behaviors. And more than 20 years ago, the famous neuroscientist Antonio Damasio pointed out that information only becomes meaningful to the extent that it evokes emotion. So connecting the head and the heart on climate change is essential for sparking and sustaining action. And we also know that climate change is emotional, right? I'm sure that you have experienced a whole spectrum of emotions. We all have when learning about and dealing with climate change, from loss and despair to hope and resolve. And if we're being honest, I would imagine that many of us here tonight have experienced some level of grief about the climate crisis. I know I have. And if that's you, you are not alone. According to the American Psychological Association, the traumas that are associated with climate change impacts can have an enormous effect on our mental, social, and spiritual well-being, and sometimes at an even greater intensity than physical impacts. Yet it is possible that the grief and the heavy emotions that we feel can also serve as a transformational catalyst that can galvanize us. And even in the process of finding your own climate story can be a sort of therapeutic experience. Through reflection and writing can prompt a path to healing, and even just acknowledging the emotions that we feel and to name them can be helpful. And sharing our stories with others can be a validating and confidence boosting and powerful experience. So in just a moment, I'm going to get into what is a climate story, and then we're going to walk through a guided process together to take some time and space here in this session to write our climate stories. And one thing I forgot to mention is that if you have questions at any point, if questions have popped up for you, you can go ahead and use the Q&A emoji at the bottom of your screen and ask those questions at any time. And during the ending portion of our session, we're going to dedicate that space to those questions. And we will likely not be able to get through all of them, but Elena will help to moderate and get through some of those questions. So feel free to use a Q&A as those questions come up. So what is a climate story? The way that we're defining it here tonight is it's a personal story that is just as much about your unique identity as a person as it is about your experience of climate change. And it could include observations that you've made. It could be about a pivotal moment, an impact that you've experienced, or a loss. It could be about solutions that you're engaged in, or ways that you feel resolve or hope. Or it could simply be about why you care about climate change. And it's a story that is descriptive, it's personal, and makes an emotional connection to the issue. So there are a few kind of tips that I'd like to share with you before we get into writing our climate stories. Know that finding your climate story takes time, and that you will likely not finish your climate story during this session, and that's okay. This work is intended to spark your story, and hopefully you'll come to a place where you will want to come back to it and complete it. And I invite you to be creative in your writing. This is not a case study or an academic piece. And if this might be more difficult for you, it might be helpful to imagine that you are writing in a journal. And then as you are writing, you will want to hone in on a specific moment or memory and describe it in detail. And as I mentioned, this is going to be a guided process, so I will be providing storytelling prompts for you to think about your experiences. But as you're writing, it can be really helpful to write in detail as much as possible using sensory imagery. And I'm going to give you a few examples of excerpts from real climate stories that might help you to imagine what that sounds like. The first example is: the water was the color of coffee with tons of cream in it, shades of red in the canyons, the rocks, the sand, and the soar of the raptors overhead. Everything welcomed us. Another example is: listening to the wind and watching the trees sway seemed endless in its capacity to captivate and calm me. And interestingly, the more detailed your story is, the more universally resonant it becomes. And research on brain-to-brain coupling has shown that when we describe our experiences vividly for others, the listener's brain actually lights up alongside ours as if we had all experienced the same events. Okay, so now we are about to switch gears and get into reflecting and writing our own climate stories. I want you to know that I'm going to be sharing a series of prompts, and the prompts that I will be asking you are personal. Know that it might feel uncomfortable and even vulnerable to dig into this work, but I'd like to assure you that what you put into this work is what you are going to get out. So I invite you to lean into that uncomfortability and into this process. So I'm going to guide you through 4 storytelling prompts. For each, I will pose a question to you, and then we'll take some time and space right in this session to simply write. So it can be really helpful to grab a journal or a piece of paper. You can use your computer, however you would like to capture your thoughts. I'm going to share the first prompt with you. Tell a story about an experience that shaped the person that you are today. And how has that influenced the way that you see the world? So note that this does not have to be climate change related. Your reflection should be personal, but does not need to connect to climate change. Okay, I'm going to call everyone back together. As I mentioned before, this is not enough time to be able to really deeply reflect and write on these prompts because they are pretty deep. So I invite you this evening or later on to come back and write some more. But we're going to go on to the next prompt, which is, what is your experience of climate change? How have you been impacted? And what observations have you noticed? Or you could write about how you've been thinking about climate change lately. Maybe things you've heard in the news recently, a conversation with a friend, or an aspect that resonates personally. So again, we're going to take 5 minutes to reflect and write on this question, and I'll go ahead and start the music again and keep time. Okay, if you could put your pens down or what you were writing with, we're going to move on to our final prompt this evening, and we're going to kind of switch gears a little bit. And so for our last prompt, I want you to ground yourself a little bit. What I have experienced is that during these first 2 prompts, often there can be some heavy experiences or feelings that may come up for you. And so you may want to take some time this evening if you're feeling low on energy or a little bit tired. There's a lot of thought and reflection that goes into thinking about climate change and how it's personally connected to you. So for this last prompt, we're going to take a moment to release some of those feelings that came up. And so I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and to go ahead and take a deep breath. Take a deep inhale and exhale. Maybe place your feet firmly on the ground to ground yourself and keep your eyes closed. What we want to do for this last prompt is to take a moment and imagine what a better world would look like to you. And we know that to create a better future, first we have to imagine ourselves there. So for this last prompt, I want you to take a moment to imagine what a better world would look like to you. Move through it in your mind, and when you have it, you can open your eyes and write it down. And for this last prompt, we're going to take just a few minutes, but again, you can always come back to this. Hopefully, you were able to get into a reflection and writing flow, and I know sometimes it can be surprising what comes out of your pen as it hits the paper. And so hopefully you can come back to this process and ask yourself additional questions. These are, of course, not the only questions we could have asked this evening. So I invite yourself to go back and continue writing and to ask yourself deeper, curious questions and see what comes out. So I'm just going to leave you with a few tips and ideas as we wrap up this talk. One of the things that can be really helpful is to take some time to look back over your writings, and they may or may not connect at all, but it can be helpful to look for connecting themes and to look for areas that you can reinforce with sensory details and emotions, making sure that you're using the 5 senses, sight, smell, hearing, taste, touch, to be able to describe and paint the picture for the listener of what your experience has been. Think about, what does your story invoke? What are the types of feelings and emotions and values in your story? And then it can be really helpful to add in one or two climate facts to help ground and reinforce your story. And then owning your story is really the most important part of finding your story. It's the sharing of it, because owning your story takes time to test it out, to practice sharing it, to make mistakes, and then get better at it. Because in the sharing of it can be an amazing tool to talk about climate change to your friends, family members, fellow students, policymakers. You can submit your story as an op-ed in the media, use it in social media, or as a way to advance policy. And the possibilities are really endless. And really, it's in the sharing of your story that builds your own confidence and ability to talk about it in meaningful ways that can connect to other people. So your story can be utilized in lots of different ways. The Eyewitness book that Climate Generation created is an anthology of stories from around Minnesota. And that book was then shared with legislators as a collective testimony. So it can be really helpful to think about how your story can help advocate for solutions. So I want to thank everybody for your time tonight. Thank you so much for being willing to lean into this process to discover your climate story.